Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Today's story, Empty, by Luke Summerhayes. Silence is not quiet. It's loud. It's a deafening roar. I've experienced quiet before. I always start work at 4 in the morning. Quiet is the gentle hum of the street lamps. It's the first song of the birds, the last scream of the foxes as they return to their warrens, the warm caress of the wind, a million things that you don't notice. Silence is none of these things. Silence is the absence even of this. Silence demands to be noticed. I was walking to the office when I felt it. It was a crisp morning, and I hadn't put on a jacket. The cold started in my arms, but it was slowly seeping into my torso. So I grabbed my arms, kept my head down, and walked on. I wasn't running late. I wasn't far from home, and I could easily have gone back and gotten a jacket, a coat, or a jumper, but I felt like I shouldn't. I didn't know why at first. I just knew to keep my eyes directly in front and keep walking, one foot in front of the other. It was dark. I could make out silhouettes, dark shapes in the gray, but it wasn't right. No street lamps, nothing from the windows or the cars surrounding me, nothing but the slow, creeping glow of the morning. After 15 minutes, I found myself at the bottom of the street. I could see my office building, but the lobby was dark. I thought perhaps there was some kind of a power cut and started making my way there quickly. As I was walking, my footsteps seemed to get louder and louder. They echoed more, ricocheting around me. I felt my heart getting faster and faster, the air colder. Before I knew it, I was running. I reached the wide glass doors and pushed, but they didn't budge. My fingers felt their way along to the cracks in the glass, up to the lock. I fumbled in my pocket for my card, felt it pressed against my leg, and pulled it out. I swiped the mechanism and heard it click, but nothing happened. I sliced the card up and down, over and over. Of course, if it hadn't worked that first time, it wasn't going to work, but admitting that would mean staying out here, and I wasn't ready to do that. I pressed my face up to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes. I darted the eyes left and right. Nobody was in sight, not even the janitor or any of the guards. I stared until it started to hurt, but there was nothing. Not even a sound. I slumped to the floor. The sun crept higher and higher. The day brought a small relief. It was warmer, at least, and being able to see up and down the road felt a little better, but the stark shadows moved along the ground all too noticeably, and the buildings seemed emptier than ever. The sky was clear blue. I must have sat there for an hour without seeing a single aircraft or solitary cloud. The roads were clear of cars. The buildings were even more empty. After a while, I pulled myself to my feet and stumbled home. In the light of the day, the city seemed even more desolate. The buildings were all a uniform shade of dull. The black roads seemed to stretch on forever. I had never made this walk during the day. I always came in so early and went home so late. The city now seemed strange, alien. Everything was gray. I'd never noticed this before, but the whole world was gray. The buildings, the roads, and the silence was always right behind me. The journey took longer than it normally did. Or perhaps the gaunt, quiet, and chilling air made it seem longer. I shivered a little as I stumbled down the street to my apartment building. I opened the door and climbed the stairs, same as ever, but even this felt different. The gentle buzz of electricity, the muffled voices from the television sets, the distant screaming of arguing families whose names I'd never even asked. I missed all of them. I reached my front door, leaned on it as I put my hand into my pocket, but the door swung open as soon as I touched it, and my heart stopped. I stepped in slowly. The room was freezing. I looked left, then right. Nothing had been moved. I ran into the living room. The TV, my PS3, my laptop, they were all still there. I breathed a sigh of relief, then turned to go into my bedroom. The door was slightly open, and in the thin crack of light I could see a dark outline. It moved. Thin, white eyes caught the light, and I knew that it was looking at me. It seemed startled. I ran towards it, blind anger replacing fear, and as I entered the room, I caught only a flash of red as it leaped through the window. I looked down onto the street, caught a glimpse of what seemed like a naked, sunburnt man disappearing down a side alley. I looked around my room again, and again nothing had been moved. For a moment, I thought that I could stop worrying. But then I saw the footprints. Blood. From my window, all around my room, and then back to the window, thick, dark, red footprints. I felt my stomach heave and my throat bulge. I turned and left the room. I went back to the living room, shutting all the doors behind me. I did not go back into that room. I went to the closet, took out a baseball bat I hadn't used since I was 12 and a Swiss Army knife my dad had bought me. I slumped into a chair and shook. Sweat was rolling down my forehead. My hair was itching something terrible. I scratched and scratched. The itch always moved as soon as I started scratching it. I chased it around my body until every inch of my skin had been touched. My breathing and my heart had returned to normal, and I felt that I'd calmed down a bit. I was hungry. I went to my kitchen, but naturally it was all empty. I ate all my meals at work or at the mall around the corner, you see. I took a deep breath and made up my mind to leave. The stairwell was empty and silent, but this time I couldn't help but notice the cold. My heart felt like a machine gun. I found myself running down each flight, stopping and peering at every corner. Eventually, I reached the street again. I stopped to catch my breath and scratch my arms, which were, of course, still itching. I stepped out onto the road and walked toward the small store that was just around the corner. I forced myself to look down the alley the intruder had run down. There was a small amount of blood leading that way, but nothing like the footprints in my apartment. I kept walking, but just as I looked up, I saw him. He was darting across the road a few 100 feet away from me. I ran after him, my fingers locking around the bat. I caught a glimpse in the corner of my eye, the other way this time. So there was more than just one. I just ran, kept going down the road, and tried to ignore them. They weren't coming for me. I ran and ran until I came straight to the door of the store. It wouldn't open naturally, but I smashed the glass with my bat without thinking. I stepped through and made my way to the snacks. I was so hungry I couldn't wait for anything to cook, so I opened up a pack of Doritos. Inside was a fine white dust. I poured it out and opened another. The same. I ripped packets and packets of chips, cookies, and candy bars from the shelves, but they were all the same, nothing inside but dust. My insides were twisting themselves into knots from hunger. I found myself coughing, doubling over onto the floor. My head was spinning. What the fuck was going on? Where was everybody? I coughed and choked until I spat up blood. My skin was itching all over. I scratched and scratched until my nails felt thick with my own blood and skin. I stopped, knelt on the floor, and stared down. My breathing returned to normal. My heart slowed down until all I could hear was the silence. The silence and a scratching noise. I stopped, listening incredulously. It was the first sound that I'd heard all day that I hadn't made myself. I crawled toward the noise. It was coming from the other side of the store, but I tried to stay low and quiet. As I got closer, I could make out a throaty, wheezing breath as well. I came around the corner onto the aisle adjacent to the sound and saw footprints, bloody like the ones in my apartment. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. I looked up toward the sound of the breathing. I rose to my feet, clutching the bat tighter than ever, and suddenly I saw someone running towards the door. I chased after them, got a good look as they crashed out into the street. They weren't human. Not quite. The body shape was the same, but there was no skin, just muscle and blood. Blood everywhere, dripping from the fingertips, pooling on the floor. The figure stopped just outside and looked back at me. I could see the round, bulbous eyes in their red cavities. There were no eyelids. I took a step toward it, and it stepped back, shaking its head. I took another step, and it turned and bolted away from me. I walked out onto the street, but I couldn't see it anywhere, just endless, silent emptiness. I dropped to the floor. The sun was high above me. I don't know how long I sat there. Nothing moved. The sun crept along the sky. The shadows swung along the ground. I kept scratching at my arms. I didn't even notice them bleeding at first. As the sky grew darker, it got colder and colder, but I didn't feel like moving. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because suddenly the sky was dull orange, the orange of early morning. I shivered, sat up, and looked out onto the inky darkness. Over the street, I saw them, a line of humanoid figures, their round, unblinking eyes staring. My heart jumped into my mouth. As I sat there and stared back, scratching an itch on my wrist, they weren't moving. Nothing was moving. It was cold, but I felt sweaty. My entire body itched, and I looked down. My clothes were red from my own blood, so I ripped them off. When I looked up, they were still there, but one of them was walking toward me. As it got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was like the other one, all muscle and bone and blood, like a biology class illustration. It stopped a few yards away and stood still, staring at me like before. I was too scared to move. I was cold and more itchy than ever. I barely even noticed that I was naked. I just kept scratching all over my skin. When the itching stopped, I would be able to stop moving. Then maybe they'd leave me alone. I was tearing into myself, ripping bits off, and it was painful, but it was a good pain. It set me free. Yeah, that's one of those stories that I can't really identify what about it scares me, but the whole damn thing just gives me the heebie-jeebies. Stay scary, my wildlings, and make the most of your nights.